Reality, as we see it, often seems like it's made of solid things. We think about objects, tiny bits called particles, and the basic forces that hold things together. But let's think about a different starting point. What if reality doesn't start with stuff, but with how things are different? The very first step is noticing that one thing is not another thing. This simple act of telling things apart, that's where everything begins. It's the smallest piece of what it means to be. Before anything can, it must first. This is a really big change in how we see things. It makes us question our usual ideas about what's most basic. This idea that difference is the foundation doesn't start with things like physical stuff or even space and time already being there. Picture a blank canvas. The very first brush stroke makes a difference. That stroke is different from the untouched canvas. It's the first act of creation. Quantum mechanics, a part of science, shows us something similar. Tiny particles exist in states of what? Looking at them or observing them forces a difference, making all the could-bes turn into one definite thing. The act of making something different creates a real thing from all those could-bes. It's difference that defines what exists. From these first differences, information starts to appear. Information isn't some magical stuff floating around in the air. Instead, information shows up when differences make patterns that we can recognize and that stay around. Think of it like a code. One dot or one dash doesn't mean much by itself, but a series of dots and dashes, like in Morse code, makes a pattern. This pattern has meaning, that's information. These patterns are built from simpler units of difference. A dot is different from a dash. A sound is different from silence. So, everything we experience, from the tiniest speck to the biggest galaxy, can be understood as a structure of information. These structures are basically complex ways of coding differences. A tree is different from the air around it. Its leaves are different from its bark. Each part is known by how it's different from other parts and from what's around it. The whole universe, seen this way, becomes like a giant, beautiful cloth woven from threads of difference. These differences, when they get organized, create all the complicated things we see. If reality is built from differences, then what about the stage it plays out on, space and time? Gap 2S. First, let's talk about space. In this way of thinking, space isn't an empty box waiting to be filled. Instead, space is understood as the way differences are laid out. It describes how different patterns of information are connected or separate. It's a map of connections based on how easy it is to tell one piece of information from another. The way space is structured comes from this web of differences. Being close or far apart in this idea of space isn't just about how far things are physically. It's more about how different or similar the information is. Two patterns of differences that are very much alike, or can easily change into one another, can be seen as close. And the other way around, patterns that are very different or need many steps to change before they can connect are far apart. Imagine a network where the spots or nodes are these differences. The connections and paths between these spots decide how things are arranged in space. This makes space an active thing that depends on relationships, not just a quiet background. Now let's talk about time. If space is how differences are arranged, then time is how we measure them changing. Time isn't some river that just flows on its own. Instead, it's a way to measure the order of changes in these patterns of differences. When one pattern of differences changes into a new one, time has passed. How fast and how these changes happen gives us our feeling of how long things take and the way time moves forward. It's a quality that appears from how these differences are always moving and changing. We can see this idea at work in things like entropy. The natural push towards things evening out, or what's called maximum entropy, is basically a process where differences get fuzzier and less clear. Neat organized patterns, which have low entropy, meaning lots of clear differences, tend to break down into messier, more similar states, which have high entropy, meaning fewer clear differences. This constant process of differences shifting, fading or popping up creates that steady flow that we feel as time. So, time is deeply connected to how these information structures, built from differences, are always changing and evolving. It's the beat of reality's differences unfolding. So then, what is matter, this stuff that seems so solid in our world? In this way of thinking, matter isn't really a basic thing all by itself. Instead, matter is made of steady patterns of differences. These are patterns that stick together and stay the same for a while. They try not to just fade back into a big blur where everything is the same. The way these special patterns of differences hold steady is what we see as physical objects. They're like waves that stay in one place in a big ocean full of all sorts of possible differences. Tiny particles, atoms and bigger things, they're all these steady patterns showing up in a bigger field of information. An electron, for example, is a supersteady pattern of differences in these quantum fields. And we can tell it's an electron because of its special features, like its charge and spin. A rock is a more complicated bunch of these steady patterns. It keeps its shape because the differences that make it up are tightly connected and don't like to change. So, when something feels solid, it really means the pattern of differences that makes it up is super strong. Consciousness, maybe one of the biggest mysteries out there, can also be understood by looking at these differences. In this way of thinking, consciousness is when a system that's pretty complex can notice its own patterns. It's like the system is looking at itself within this whole web of differences. When a system can not only process differences from the outside, like what it sees or hears, but can also spot and understand the patterns of its own inner workings and feelings, then something like awareness starts to happen. It's like a next-level way of noticing differences. Think about computer brains, called artificial neural networks, as an example. These networks learn by finding patterns in data, and data is basically just a bunch of differences. The more advanced ones can even create their own picture of how they are processing things. Now, this isn't exactly real consciousness, but it helps show the main idea. So, a conscious being is like a system that's gotten really good at understanding and reacting to its own inner world of changing differences, knowing its own patterns from everything else. Being able to tell these inner differences apart is the key. Observing plays a super important part in how we connect with this reality of differences. Observing isn't just passively seeing facts that are already there. Instead, observing is an active thing we do where we choose or lock in on one specific difference or pattern of differences from lots of possibilities. It's an act that makes what be into what real. Before we observe, many differences can exist together, kind of all mixed up or uncertain. When the observer interacts, it makes one particular setup clear and definite. We can see examples of this in quantum mechanics. The famous double-slit experiment shows that tiny particles can act like waves, going through both slits at once, a mix-up of different paths, until someone observes them. Observing makes the particle choose just one path, locking in that specific difference. In cognitive science, which is the study of how we think, attention works in a similar way. Our senses are hit with tons of information all the time. Attention picks out certain differences for us to notice, filtering out all the rest. So, observing is a really basic way we connect with and even shape the reality we experience. Ultimately, you can think of the whole universe as a giant, never-ending, interconnected web of differences. It doesn't really have a definite beginning or end, not in the way we usually think about it. Instead, it's a constant unfolding and rearranging of all these differences. Everything that happens, from the tiniest little quantum wiggle to the biggest structures in space, shows a certain level of how complex and organized things are in this universal web. There's no basic stuff at the very bottom. There's just this web of differences that keeps getting more and more detailed. So everything we see and experience are just different levels of how organized and complex things are in this huge, always changing network. A thought is just a quick pattern of differences in our brain activity. A star is a long-lasting, complex pattern of differences in energy and matter. Life itself is an incredibly complex system that's really good at keeping and spreading specific patterns of differences, even when everything else tends to become all the same. The universe, all of it, is like a giant game of differences, always changing, making new forms and letting old ones fade away.